This is the story of God choosing David from the Abeka curriculum. Enjoy! God wanted Israel to have a king who would follow his ways and his leadership. He wanted the king to lead his people and to love and trust him so he could pour out his blessings on his nation, Israel. Saul, Israel's first king, started out as a very humble man, but soon he became proud and arrogant. When the prophet Samuel scolded King Saul for his rebellion, Saul was not at all sorry or repentant. Finally, God said to Samuel, "Take a horn of oil, go to Bethlehem and find a man named Jesse, for I have chosen one of his sons to be the next king of Israel." Samuel did as the Lord told him. When he arrived in Bethlehem, Samuel asked Jesse to introduce his sons to him. Jesse brought his oldest son, whose name was Eliab, before Samuel. Eliab was tall and handsome. The prophet Samuel took one look at him and thought, "Surely this is the one the Lord has chosen to be the next king over Israel." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by the look of a man's face or how tall he is, or by the way he looks on the outside. I do not see things the way you do. Men judge by outward appearance, but I look at the heart. And this is not the one I have chosen to be Israel's next king." What the Lord said to Samuel is so true. We often judge a person by the way he looks on the outside. Tall or short, curly hair or straight, chubby or thin. Is he a good basketball player? Does he have fun toys? Does he let me play with him? But God says the outside is not what he looks at. What really counts with God is what we are on the inside. The Lord sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Are we kind, generous with our things, treating everyone as we would want them to treat us? That's what is important to the Lord. Then Jesse told his second son, Abinadab, to step forward and meet Samuel. But the Lord said to Samuel, "This is not the one I have chosen either." In the same way, 7 of Jesse's sons came before Samuel. They were all fine-looking young men, but so was King Saul. Samuel thought to himself, "Surely one of them will be the one God has chosen." But no, God refused all 7 of Jesse's sons. What was the matter? Should Samuel start with the first and look them all over again? Samuel shook his head and thought, "The Lord has not chosen any of these. All have been refused." "Jesse," Samuel asked, "are these all the sons you have?" "Well, no," Jesse replied. "There's one more, the youngest, but he's out in the field caring for the sheep." "Send for him immediately," Samuel said, "for we will not sit down to eat until he has come." David, Jesse's youngest son, was at that very moment out in the fields with his father's sheep. David played his harp and sang songs to God as his sheep nibbled the grass nearby. Suddenly, he heard a shout, "David! David!" It was one of his father's servants. "I'm here. What do you want? Is something wrong?" The servant came running to him and said, "Your father wants you to come home at once. The prophet Samuel is here." "The prophet Samuel?" "Yes, he wants to see you." "Why would he want to see me?" David must have wondered. David got up and started home as fast as he could, wondering what this was all about. When he arrived, Jesse hurried him right over to where the prophet Samuel was. Samuel saw a young man with handsome features coming toward him. His cheeks were rosy and his eyes were bright and clear. At that moment, the Lord told Samuel, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." So Samuel took the horn of oil and poured a soft stream of oil on David's head. Samuel knew that this was the sign that David would be the next king of Israel. Perhaps the oldest prophet bent over and whispered in young David's ear the meaning of the sacred symbol, "You will be the next king." Later on, what an inspiration this would be to David. What a preparation for the future that God had planned for him. But he must wait for God's time. After the feast, the prophet Samuel returned to his home in Ramah, and David returned to the sheepfolds. From that day on, the power of the Spirit of the Lord was upon David. God had great plans for him, but there would be many trials along the way before David would become king. God seemed very close to David after he was anointed by the prophet Samuel. because David loved the Lord, whatever he did it to please the Lord. Being a good shepherd to his sheep, David would have had the shepherd's staff ready when he needed it. The crook on the end of the staff would be used to pull in the sheep who tried to wander away from the flock. Sometimes a shepherd also used his staff for protection. Maybe a snake would slither through the grass and frighten the sheep, but David was ready with his rod. He kept the slingshot nearby too. He practiced hurling stones with his sling until he became an expert with it. The sling could also be used to protect his sheep. When a sheep or lamb strayed out of David's sight, he would climb on a high rock and begin calling the sheep by name. The sheep knew his voice and returned to him. Each evening, David carefully examined each sheep as it went under the rod through the entrance to the sheepfold. If a sheep was bruised or cut, David poured soothing oil over the sore spot to help it heal. One day, while David was watching his sheep, he heard a long, deep growl. He jumped to his feet just in time to see a bear carrying off in his mouth one of David's young lambs. Asking God to help him, David ran toward the bear and killed the bear with his bare hands, saving the terrified lamb. Another time, while David was watching his sheep, a big, hungry lion crept into the flock, grabbed the young sheep, and started to run away. Immediately, David ran after him. The lion dropped the sheep and turned on David. Grabbing the beast, David, with his own bare hands, killed the lion. It was the Spirit of God that gave David the courage and power to defend his sheep from the bear and the lion. David was learning to trust God in the problems of life. Do you have problems? Then, like David, you too can ask God for help. He can help you with any problem. We can trust Him for the solutions to our problems just as David did. Remember, the Bible tells us that the devil as a roaring lion walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. 1 Peter 5:8. God can help us to overcome the devil, just as He helped David overcome the lion and the bear. Surely David sang a glad song of thanksgiving to the Lord after such experiences, because he knew that it was God who had protected and helped him. He sang and played on his harp day after day while taking care of his sheep. He soon became a very skilled harp player as well as a good singer. Shepherds are often alone, so that gave David lots of time to talk to God. He soon learned to know the Lord like a friend and to trust Him. David sang songs about the beauty of God's wonderful outdoor world. He sang about the Lord being his shepherd. That is Psalm 23. Do you know that psalm? He sang about the loveliness of the early morning and the wonder of night. He sang about the comfort and help that God gives in time of trouble. For hundreds of years, people of all ages have been blessed and strengthened by the songs, or psalms, that David wrote. David is known as the sweet psalmist of Israel. King Saul, who ruled over Israel, was frustrated and troubled in his mind. His servants felt sorry for him and wondered if some singing and harp music might soothe the king's troubled mind. Some of them had heard what a good harp player David was, and they mentioned this to the king. King Saul had David brought to the palace, and when he played for the king, it pleased Saul and made the king feel better. Saul even invited David to stay at the palace while he played. What an opportunity this was for David. He learned much about the duties of a king and about the things that would be most helpful to him when it was time for him to rule Israel. What a contrast! On the throne sat proud, rebellious King Saul, who had started out so well, but had become proud, disobedient, and miserable. Instead of surrendering to the Lord, King Saul allowed self, not God, to rule on the throne of his heart and life. Though in the past he had led Israel to great military victories, he took the credit for himself and gradually felt he didn't need God. He became consumed with doing things his own way. When he had disobeyed God, he argued back and made excuses for why he did not obey the Lord. Now he was in a terrible, troubled state of mind. Near the throne of King Saul sat youthful David with his cheerful expression and thoughtful ways. God had anointed him a man after his own heart to be the next king. David was truly the kind of man that God would be able to use. Though David had already been anointed king in Saul's place by the prophet Samuel, he was willing to serve Saul, or tend to his father's sheep, or to do whatever else was needed until it was God's time for him to be king. Are you like David? willing, obedient, and cheerful? Or are you rebellious and selfish like King Saul? You can be like David by saying no to what you want to do and saying yes to what God wants you to do. Remember, man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. As God looks at our hearts right now, does he see a heart that is cheerful and obedient and wants to please God in all things? If not, let's confess that to God right now and ask him to forgive us and make us more like David.